I'm going to make some videos about Plato's Phaedo, which is a dialogue written by Plato, very prominent dialogue written by Plato 2,500 years ago, which is set very dramatically on the day that Socrates died. Um, the dialogue itself purports to be a conversation between Socrates and his friends in the hours before Socrates drinks the hemlock in fulfillment of the death sentence that has been put upon him by the Athenians for corrupting the youth of Athens. It's a great work of art. It's a great literary work. It's a classic. So it has to be approached somewhat differently than the kind of things we've been reading so far, which have been, very good philosophy essays, really some of my favorites. But this is, of course, in a different order. This is a classic of world literature as well as being a work in philosophy that deals with certain problems. So my advice is just to sit down and read it and then get a sense of what the overall structure is and the drama of it. It kind of breaks up into different parts. I hope that I'm able to help you trace those in the videos that I do. But again, this is a class with a certain focus on death and in approaching certain problems with death and trying to see what the different possible solutions are to those problems. And so, however great a work of art it may be, and it is a great work of art, as most of well, many or most or all of Plato's dialogues are, at the end of the day, we're evaluating it in terms of whether it actually establishes the philosophical thesis about death that it argues for, that it's trying to establish. I would say that that it's pretty obvious what it is that Socrates has to try to prove in this dialogue, and more or less, I suppose, in the context of our reading for this course, he has to prove that Epicurus is wrong. He has to prove that death is not the absolute end of the person. That basically that Epicurus' starting point with regard to death is mistaken. You'll see one of the things I emphasize in the reading of the Phaedo in this course is in the context or in relation to Epicurus, and that is to say that both of them, that they have different and absolutely incompatible theories of death, and that those theories start with a certain assumption about what death is, and then they move forward. We saw that Epicurus' starting point, his basic assumption about what death is that death is the privation of all awareness. That is, that death is the taking away of all capacity for experience of any sort. It's the privation of all sensation, the privation of all awareness, the privation of all consciousness. And he never tries to argue for that. He says he more or less just states it and challenges us to either accept or reject it, but perhaps to him it was obvious. And so everything sort of follows from that. All the puzzles about Epicurus' view of death, what death is, whether death can be considered a bad thing for the person who dies, they all follow from that basic starting point or assumption. Plato's or Socrates' starting point in the Phaedo is that death, as we'll see, death is the separation of soul and body. He doesn't try to argue for it. He doesn't provide any kind of supporting arguments, proof, evidence for that. It's like Epicurus, he has a starting point in his theory that death is the separation of soul and body. And everything, just as sort of all the puzzles of Epicurus follow from his starting point, all the puzzles of Plato start from his starting point. If death is the separation of soul and body, then what happen? We know what happens to body. That is, we know that body becomes corpse. A non-living body immediately begins to decay and really to become something else, to decay, to disintegrate, and to cease to be what it was after that separation. But what happens to soul? And what obviously Plato wants to prove is that soul continues to live. Soul continues to have an existence after its separation from the body. And I suppose, moreover, that existence is an immortal, an eternal existence. But the basic, or the root question, or the most pressing question, is whether soul can exist without body. So after that separation, what happens to soul is the immediate question. And in a certain sense, however great a literary work it is, however many different questions and it addresses, and it does address many, and however subtle the nuances are, and however mysterious certain aspects of the dialogue are, when we sit down to evaluate the dialogue, what we are evaluating is whether Plato has actually plausibly established that after this separation, the supposed separation of soul and body, that soul goes on, that soul continues to exist independently of body, which is a very difficult thing to try to establish. And Socrates in the dialogue is well aware of the task that he is trying to accomplish. That is no easy task at all. So I'll be making some videos trying to help you with maybe some of the more, what I consider to be the more essential parts of the dialogue, at least for us. But keep in mind that it is the ultimate, or the essential goal of the dialogue, I suppose, is to try to establish that what he's calling a soul can indeed exist independently of body.